Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. This week's project is for an N-scale layout. It's a long, narrow space. The room is around 16 feet long, but it's less than 7 feet wide. And it's a bit of an awkward space. Not only is there a closet in one corner, which takes up some of it, but the entrance is in the middle of one of the long walls, which means there is only one place in the room where we can get a long straight run. Now, before anyone writes to tell me that there's an inaccuracy in the drawing, yes, I know these two walls either side of the entry don't line up. That is not an error. The room is slightly wider at one end than it is at the other. Anyway, regardless of how convenient or otherwise the room is, there is always going to be a best footprint available. So let's play around with some possibilities and see what fits. Here was my first attempt to see if we could get a folded dog bone in the room without having to cross the doorway. Obviously we could put one curve in each of the two south corners and have a very short run between them, but I was trying to wrap one end around further to extend the run slightly. And with the minimum 18-inch radius curve that the client wanted, clearly this isn't going to work. There's just not enough aisle width remaining. So I abandoned the quest for walk-in access and accepted the fact that we were going to have to cross the door in some manner. Now, there is no door across the entry, and the client said it was okay for a swing gate to open out of the room and encroach into the living space in the next room, because there would be no furniture in front of it, and the gate would only be open for short periods of time when entering or leaving the train room. Now, it was obvious from the start that the client was going to need multiple decks because of what he wanted to include. So obviously there was going to need to be a helix somewhere. Now, in N scale, it's generally best to allow at least a 3-inch vertical rise per lap, and at a 2% grade we need approximately a 22-inch radius curve to get that. So here is a 22-inch radius helix, and it just fits at the narrow end of the room, allowing the closet door to open beside it. The client said he was okay with removing the closet door, so that led me to a possible improvement. We can elongate the helix using a 15-inch radius curve. This one has the same circumference as the 22-inch diameter circular helix, but it allows the visible portion to be slightly longer. So that is a net gain. We settled on 15-inch radius for hidden curves because all N-scale equipment will go around those quite easily. And actually, the elongated helix does have one benefit. It's very easy to add turnouts into it and add passing sidings around the inside at a substandard radius, because we have the straight sections that we can cut in turnouts. So just keep that in mind, and I will get back to that later in this discussion. Although there was no other sensible place in the room for a circular helix, I did wonder whether it's possible to orient this helix the other way and improve the length even more. So this is the next one I drew. This is the same helix turned through 90 degrees and placed in the wide end of the room. And it looks like there's just enough space to get beside it, with a 2-foot aisle at this end, 18 inches of benchwork on the one side, and just a narrow section, just enough for a single track and a tree line running around the outside of the helix. Now, I don't like 2-foot aisles, but notice how it's only a short side extension. The majority of the length of the aisle is still 3 feet wide. And the client and I both agreed that this seemed like the most promising footprint for the railroad. We did try tweaking it just a little bit more to see if we could improve it somewhat. Here I'm keeping the benchwork parallel the whole length of the north wall at only 18 inches wide, figuring that's almost the equivalent of a 3-foot benchwork in HO scale, which is what I'm used to working with. And we figure that with narrow benchwork it might be possible to put the decks closer together and get more of them in. This was very relevant because of a discussion we had already had about what the client wanted to fit into the room. I suppose at this point I should discuss what the client said he wanted to fit into the room. He wanted to represent both San Diego and Denver with their passenger stations as close to prototype as possible, and 2 mountain ranges with staging at both ends of the main line. And when I first read this, my first thought was to tactfully tell the client that this was going to be impossible in the space he had available. But by then the client had already pointed out that based on my previous designs that he had seen, doing the impossible was my specialty. So I decided to see what could be done in the room. And that is why, as I mentioned earlier, we decided to keep the benchwork to a maximum of about 18 inches so that we could put the decks closer together. With wider benchwork, it's generally necessary to be able to get one's upper torso between the decks, but with 18-inch deep seams, one can reach everything just with one's arms. Anyway, I played around with a few more variations of this basic footprint. Many of them never got drawn, they were only floating around in my head. We did ultimately decide to widen the benchwork along this bottom right corner on the lower scenic deck only, to allow more space for the San Diego harbor scene that the client particularly wanted to include. Here is the lower staging level. I'll talk about that a bit later. Here is the general arrangement drawing for the lower scenic deck, the San Diego deck. We'll come up from lower staging. The client wanted a beach scene, and this seemed like a good place to put it. It's a minimum radius curve which isn't going to be appropriate for much else other than running distance, and the beach scene really needed to go in order prior to reaching San Diego. And obviously the only place in the room where we can put a decent passenger station is along this north wall. And I have a short spur to the port along this wider area of benchwork, while the main line starts to climb along this south wall, heads back into the Helix to go to the next level. And I also figured it would be possible to get cut-off tracks running in the gap between the Helix sections to make continuous runs on each level. And as we can see here, the main aisle is still 36 inches wide. The entry aisle is 30 inches, which, although it's narrower than I would have liked, it's still as wide as a typical interior doorway. And here is the narrower extension at the left side of the room at only 24 inches wide, which can only ever be occupied by one person at a time. Okay, let's go back to the lower staging level. There is a good amount of room for staging, and with the direction of the Helix travel, we end up being able to curve the ladder around this corner and get plenty of length for a reversing loop at the end of the room, and we can still run a good length of train. And as is typical with my plans, I try to include a few extra tracks for spare locomotive storage, and as always a control cabinet for the DCC components. With the reversing loop in the corner as compact as possible in order to save space, I found that the circumference of it was 124 inches, so that is our maximum train length, just over 10 feet, which is pretty good in N scale. We've already seen the San Diego level. Here is the middle scenic level, and this level is just a twice round loop through mountainous scenery, and it's possible to get two continuous circuits, one on each level, the outer circuit being slightly higher in elevation than the inner one. There has to be a break in this corner because the client wanted a tall timber trestle. I couldn't put it on the mountain deck because that would have meant dropping into the airspace needed for the San Diego level below it. So it has to go on the Denver level instead. Okay, the upper scenic level is the Denver level, with Denver being in the only place that we can have a long run, along that north wall again. The schematic is basically the same as the lower level, but in this corner we have the trestle scene. The client wanted to include a representation of the Goat Canyon trestle in California. We had to compromise and put it in the wrong mountain range because, as I mentioned earlier, it couldn't go the other side of Denver without ruining the San Diego level. And the intention is that the scenery in this corner can drop down through the middle level, with one of those laps briefly reappearing lower down in the scene, and the other loop being hidden below and behind the trestle. Now, one of the compromises we had to make is that the Rocky Mountain section is reduced to about an 8-foot run along this wall, ending in the Moffat Tunnel, which we ended up later deleting anyway. We decided it was just going to be a regular tunnel portal, which needed to be obscured as much as possible for other reasons. I will get into those later. And finally we arrive at sky staging. Yes, I know that is 5 decks in all. The plan is to put them 16 inches apart instead of my usual 20, and allowing 4 inches for benchwork. That gives a 12-inch reach-in distance between each one. I recommended that before we went any further in the design, the client got some adjustable bookshelves and mocked up all these heights just to make sure that he was happy with them. And we did do a fair bit more discussion on heights, and we tweaked them somewhat. And for a long time, the client was wondering if we needed to delete one of the decks, but didn't know which one to delete. So at this stage, the design stayed on my drawing board for quite a while I worked on other designs, until I got the go-ahead to continue with the 5-deck plan. I started work on the San Diego level first, and this is what I was able to come up with for a track arrangement. The real San Diego passenger depot has 6 tracks in front of it. The 2 nearest the depot are used for a light rail system. The next 2 are regular long-distance passenger tracks, and then there's 2 freight tracks furthest from the depot. We have to make some compromises here because there was nowhere else that we could possibly get any kind of a freight yard, so we needed more than just 2 freight tracks in front of the depot. In order to keep the track density under control, we made the decision to drop the light rail system from double track to single, and there are now only 3 passenger tracks, with the middle one being shared between the light rail and the long distance passenger services. I've called this LA Junction because it's at the Los Angeles end of the railroad, the lower staging representing the city of Los Angeles, and every train in this direction heading down to LA. The continuous circuit, although it's available for just watching trains run round in circles if the client wants to, operationally it's only used for the light rail. And I put a light rail layover track inside the Helix. Right next to the real San Diego station there is a double track Y for the light rail service. As I mentioned, we reduced it to single track, and it has to be distorted somewhat. In reality, it should curve around sharply behind the depot, whereas we've had this leg more or less straight for most of its length, and the opposite leg is the sharply curved one. Note, by this time we have corrected the shape of the closet, and it turns out there is a lot more room inside it than my original drawing, which was very beneficial. We ended up making good use of the closet on all 5 levels. There is a sump pump in the floor, and these 2 black dots represent the piping to it. The client mentioned right from the outset that he was perfectly happy rerouting the plumbing to suit the railroad design. And although the overall configuration of the San Diego level remained more or less the same, the details did change quite dramatically as the plan developed. Here is the next iteration. I'm trying to leave more water in the harbour area so that the client can build a decent sized ship. So we decided to move the grain elevator away from this area. We did briefly try putting it at the other end of San Diego Harbour, but ultimately it got deleted from here as well. The client wanted this space for other purposes, and we were still hopeful of getting a good sized grain elevator on the Denver level. This rectangle at the top of the plan represents the full scale size of the San Diego passenger depot, although the ship in the harbour is still a little on the small side. This inset represents a full-size Panamax container ship, and obviously there was going to be no room for anything like that, although we did some research and found that Dole Exports did operate a much smaller container ship, and we thought it might be possible to represent that. The ship here as drawn is too small to represent the Dole California, I think it's called, but it seemed feasible to extend the wide benchwork all the way to the corner, bearing in mind that we're going to do this on the bottom deck only, so the client can still lean over it to reach the back on the other levels. Now in this plan, although I still have the drawing as a generic cargo vessel, I have stretched its dimensions to represent the full-scale size of the Dole California. And it does indeed fit, even though it does rather overwhelm the entire pier. In reality, there is supposed to be room for 2 ships on this same pier, one serving Dole and the other one serving the Marine Corps base. Now at this point in the design, the client was still indecisive about whether to go with 2 scenic levels or 3, and since that would make a huge difference to the levels above, I didn't want to waste a lot of time on those at this point, so I decided to go back and finish the lower staging level instead. Here is the lower staging level fully fleshed out. And at this point I'm also filling in all the tentative elevations. We did end up raising this level slightly to make it easier to get under it. Here is the San Diego deck with all the elevations in it. I'm not going to go through them in detail. They are very complex, especially around the Helix, with all the continuous runs cutting through it. Here is a first look at the middle level. As I mentioned earlier, we're going twice round. We appear at this point, go around the front track, bypass the Helix, and then lap around again 4 inches higher up before entering the Helix to climb up to Denver. The client did want a little bit of operation on this level. He showed me a photograph of an abandoned Arco mine. It turned out it was quite possible to bring it back into operation again. And he also wanted a spur leading off to an unobtainium mine, a pet project of his that he wanted to include even though it's total fantasy. And rather than cluttering up this deck with a huge online industry, we decided to have it off stage, represented by 2 staging tracks, wrapping around the closet and then under the scenery, with just a minimal yard to sort cars of unobtainium. And the client is going to use strings of 2-bay covered hoppers for this service, assuming that the ore is carried in fine powder form and the railroad doesn't want it blowing away. Well, there is one slight error here. The elevation of the flyover should be 50.5 inches, not 50 3/4. Here is the upper scenic level, the Denver level. The client and I were both very happy with how much I was able to get in here. This was another scene that the client wanted to include, a representation of the 5 parks, passing siding and maintenance of waste storage. There are some house backs along an embankment at this point, and since the client once lived in 5 parks, this area was something that he really wanted to include if at all possible. Denver passenger station is actually quite distinctive. The client has already created files to 3D print it, and although it's reduced in size, this is a reasonable representation of it. The biggest compromise is that for the client's desired schematic to work, it had to be extended into a through station from a stub terminal. And although I didn't realise it until later, apparently it used to be a through station and was recently cut back into a stub. The way to get around that is at this end of the station, these structures can be reduced by 1 story to keep the approximate proportions, allowing the road to be raised in elevation and the tracks to run underneath it. The diesel shop that the client particularly wanted has a very distinctive shape. It's a bit distorted and it's reduced from 3 tracks to 2, but there was a small roundhouse in the area during steam days, and 1 stall of that was incorporated into the diesel shop, and I've been able to include that arrangement, even though the whole building has had to be relocated and built as a mirror image in order to fit. The road system over the tracks in this corner is something the client particularly liked, and I was actually able to copy the arrangement of this particular junction fairly accurately. Beyond Denver Station, everything is very much compressed and compromised because we're completely running out of space at this point. There really isn't a lot of space for the brewery that the client wanted to include, so I've included a small stub yard to be able to switch cars in, and I've had 1 track leading off the front of the benchwork, implying that it leads to most of the brewery complex. There is room for some industry in the rear. This is a fairly accurate rendition of one of the Coors grain elevators, which the guy particularly liked. And this other track in this corner, currently labelled an optional industry, we ultimately decided to make that the Coors cold storage warehouse. I mentioned earlier that this corner was going to be occupied by a tall wood trestle. The client really wanted to include a representation of the Goat Canyon Trestle in California. We had to compromise by relocating it by thousands of miles. The real trestle is on a curve just like this one, even though it's a somewhat broader curve. The Goat Canyon Trestle claims to be the tallest wood trestle ever built. I'm not sure if that's in the US or in the world. It doesn't matter, it's a tall trestle. As drawn, it's less than half its prototype length, but it can be almost full-scale height. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the last few feet of this level is all that we have available to represent part of the Rocky Mountains. The main line disappears for the last time in this corner and heads up to the sky staging level. With the need to exit the Helix in the wrong direction, the ladder at this end was rather cramped, and this resulted in sacrificing some length for the staging tracks, and this meant that if I kept the same loop arrangement as on the lower staging, the tracks would have been too short for a maximum train length. So I've put a bypass track at the rear of the staging yard as part of the loop. And that allows these staging tracks to be significantly longer than they need to be, which is great since one is going to have to be parking them either with closed circuit TV or with a ceiling mounted mirror because they are above eye level. As I mentioned earlier, we did do quite a lot of tweaking with the elevations. So going back to the lower staging level, we have a few slight changes. We've eliminated one lap of the Helix and the lowest scenic has dropped 2 inches. I've corrected the elevation here. Everything is 2 inches lower. And then on the sky staging level, the 2 inches extra clearance he has before reaching the ceiling makes a lot of difference. I may not have mentioned it earlier, but the ceiling here is a little less than 8 feet. And the client wanted more headroom while he was laying track on this top level. At this point in the design, the client sent me some more photographs. He was wondering if it was possible to add in a representation of part of another town. Remember, this area was originally meant to represent the Five Parks area where the client used to live. He asked if it was possible to also add in a representation of the old town area of the town of Avada. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly. Arvada. This town area in front is a fairly reasonable rendition of it, if you accept the fact that it is on a mirror image of the original. This road also has to be a bridge over the railroad instead of a grade crossing. And the water tank has had to be relocated because there was nowhere for it where it needed to be. Other than that, as I mentioned, it's a fairly accurate rendition of that part of the old town. And the client very much liked what I was able to do with it. Okay, this is the final version of the lower staging with all the annotations removed, so it's a clean view. Here is the San Diego level with all the scenic suggestions filled in. As I mentioned earlier, we have a full-size rendition of the passenger depot. This street crosses all the tracks at grade and heads down the cruise ship terminal pier between two parts of the harbour. It should actually be at the other end of the station, but there was no space for it, so we relocated at this end. Also, putting it at the other end would have meant that it passed through the middle of the freight yard, which would have completely ruined operations. So this was a better place for it. There's a space for a full-size model of the Star of India, which is a tall ship on display near San Diego Depot. There should be about 2 more city blocks before the water, but we're claiming modeler's license to get it in. This area is full of high-rise glass hotels. I haven't tried to represent them accurately. I've just drawn them in as placeholders. Note how this level is mostly grey. In satellite photographs, San Diego does appear as pretty much an all-grey city, although there are a few splashes of colour. Near the station there was a high-rise hotel that had a dense green parklight area just outside it with the pool in the middle, so I decided to include that, even though the shape is somewhat different. There's another grade crossing giving access to that hotel because there are several of them in the area. I filled in the beach scene, and that ended up a lot closer to the photograph he sent me than I expected. The curve is very much sharper than it should be, which was always going to be the case. But the thing that he most liked about the scene that he chose was that the main line curved and dived under the Pacific Coast Highway at an angle, and I was able to include that. Initially, I didn't think it was going to be possible because the tracks disappearing out of the scene at the other end have to be 3 inches higher than the one that's visible. But closer examination of the photographs revealed that the highway viaduct was actually very tall, so it actually works. I've indicated much denser tree cover than there should be in this scene to obscure these non-existent tracks as much as possible. And one very small detail, although this track is actually underneath the non-existent track that crosses over it, we can suggest that it comes out the other side of the highway by leaving a small gap in the tree line where this other track should be. Here is the middle level with all the scenery suggestions filled in. The client suggested that he would like a fall scene, and one of the mine photographs that he sent me also made a note of the fall colours, so I turned the mine area into a fall scene, extending it across the swing gate and making the transition on this very narrow section of benchwork where it's a lot easier to do. The staging for the unobtainium mine has been increased to 3 tracks. with the middle one being substandard radius at 13.5 inches. Although you can't see it on this plan, I also lengthened the 3 tracks all the way back to about here, where they can stage trains of maximum length, and I adjusted the location of this turnout so that the switch machine will miss them. Here is the Denver level with all the scenery filled in. I was able to get this grain elevator full depth by using the area in the doorway, and we've added a pair of tracks leading off stage into the closet, supposedly serving another part of the complex and also providing more car capacity to improve the switching possibilities with trains serving the brewery. And these 3 tracks disappear under a sky bridge connecting these 2 buildings. Around this corner there is another track because the client wanted to include the commuter route, so that now disappears under this road next to the main line to a 2-track staging yard inside the Helix. And he wanted to know if this middle track around here could be lengthened into a full-length passing siding, and indeed it can. I mentioned earlier that one of the advantages of the elongated Helix is that we can wrap a passing siding around the middle of it, and we can cut turnouts into the straight track. By putting the turnout in this location, it ends up at about 6 inches longer than our maximum train length, which is perfect. Initially, I didn't think there was going to be any benefit to having a full passing siding here. I figured it was just going to be a dummy track just for show. But thinking more in depth about the potential operation, there's only 2 tracks available for freight through Denver, and any switching operations are going to be tying up both of them. So actually having a full-length passing siding nearby could be very useful for stashing a train out of the way while these 2 freight tracks are blocked. And we also got discussing the possibility of adding additional passing sidings inside the Helix at other strategic points. There is room for at least one of them on each of the 4 sections of the Helix between the decks. Now, making them one full lap is going to be slightly shorter than a maximum train length, so the best way around that is to make them 1.5 laps, and that gives plenty of leeway when parking a train blind. And lastly, here is a clean view of the upper staging with all the annotations removed. I'm just going to cycle back through the other levels quickly. Here's the Denver level. Please feel free to pause if you want a longer look. Here's the mountain level. And here's the San Diego level. I think that's about all there is to say about this layout design project. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation, found it useful or interesting or both, and I hope to see you back next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.